After the court hearings, Maggie came back home, boxes still half-packed, taking in the stillness. The house wasn't much, just 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that had seen better days, and a tiny backyard with overgrown grass. A peaceful and safe place, but Maggie still feels heartbroken remembering what she and her daughter went through. On that fated day, Maggie walked briskly out of the office, her mind preoccupied with the thought of getting home to Emily, her 12-year-old daughter. It had been a long day at work, and all she wanted was a quiet evening. But as she parked the car and stepped into the house, a strange tension began to weigh on her. Something felt off, but she couldn't place it. She brushed it aside, pushing herself up the stairs to Emily's room. "Emily, sweetie, dinner's almost ready," she called out, her voice light, masking the subtle unease creeping up her spine. When she opened the door to Emily's room, what she saw hit her like a punch to the gut. Emily stood there, her back turned to her mother, staring blankly at the wall. Maggie's eyes dropped to her daughter's pants, and there it was, a deep red stain right on the crotch of her faded jeans. The sight of it froze Maggie in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. A cold wave of panic rolled through her, crashing into the quiet of the evening. "Emily?" Maggie's voice trembled slightly, though she tried to keep it steady. "What happened, honey?" she asked, stepping closer, her heart pounding in her chest like a wild animal. She crouched down to Emily's level, gently turning her daughter towards her. But instead of answering, Emily just threw her arms around Maggie's neck, holding her tightly, almost desperately. The hug wasn't warm or reassuring. It was the kind of hug that spoke of fear, of secrets too heavy for a child to carry. Maggie's thoughts raced. Was it an accident? Was it something worse? 100 questions bubbled up, but she couldn't bring herself to ask them. All she could do was hold her daughter tighter, the uncertainty gnawing at her insides. Dinner that night was a stifling affair. The clinking of forks against plates was the only sound in the room, the silence thick with unspoken worries. Maggie's stepmother, Fiona, sat across from her, watching them both with a calmness that Maggie envied. She tried to keep up the pretense of normalcy, but Maggie could feel her pulse in her throat, every second dragging on painfully. "I'm sure it's nothing," Fiona finally said, breaking the silence. Her voice was soothing, the way it always was when she tried to smooth things over. It could just be her first period, Maggie. These things happen early sometimes. No need to worry too much. But Maggie wasn't so sure. She wanted to believe Fiona desperately, but the sight of that red stain kept replaying in her mind like a broken record. It wasn't just the blood, it was the way Emily had looked at her, the emptiness in her daughter's eyes, the fear behind that hug. There was something more here, something darker. Maggie could feel it in her bones. That night, Maggie lay awake in bed, her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. The house was silent, but inside her head, the questions were loud, relentless. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that stain again, bright and glaring against the fabric of Emily's pants. And the silence, that awful silence from Emily, her daughter, who used to chatter about everything, was now a closed book. What had happened? What was she hiding? Maggie tossed and turned, unable to shake the feeling that something terrible had happened right under her nose. The room felt too small, too quiet, like the air had grown thick with secrets. She could hear Fiona's words echoing in her head. "It's probably nothing, just a period." But Maggie's gut told her otherwise. There was something she wasn't seeing, something Emily wasn't telling. As the hours crept by, the anxiety tightened its grip on her chest. She knew she wouldn't rest until she found out the truth. The next morning, Maggie woke up with a heavy heart. She barely slept, her mind haunted by the image of Emily's blood-stained pants and the silence that followed. The air in the house felt thick, every creak of the floorboards and soft hum of the refrigerator only heightening the tension. She knew she couldn't let another day pass without doing something. Whatever had happened to Emily needed to come to light, but how could she get her daughter to open up? That quiet fear in her eyes last night, it was like something had locked itself inside her, refusing to let go. Maggie decided to take the day off from work. Nothing else mattered today except Emily. She poured herself a cup of coffee, trying to steady her nerves, but her hands still trembled as she held the mug. "Today," she muttered under her breath. "Today, we'll figure this out." Emily was sitting in the living room, curled up in her favorite spot on the couch with her legs tucked underneath her, staring blankly at the television. The cartoons were on, but Emily didn't seem to be paying attention. Maggie sat down next to her, close enough to feel the tension radiating from her little girl. "How about we go to the park today?" Maggie asked, her voice soft but careful not to sound too eager. "We can get some ice cream after, it'll be fun." Emily didn't look at her. She just shrugged, her eyes still fixed on the screen, though Maggie was sure she wasn't really watching. Maggie's heart sank a little more. She'd expected some reluctance, but this emptiness, this wasn't like Emily. Usually a mention of ice cream would light up her face, but now there was nothing. "Hey," Maggie reached over and gently touched Emily's arm. "You can talk to me, you know? If something's wrong, we can figure it out together." For a moment, Emily's eyes flickered, but she quickly turned away, wrapping her arms around herself like she was trying to hold herself together. They went to the park anyway. It was a quiet, grey afternoon, with clouds hanging low in the sky, as if the weather itself mirrored Maggie's mood. She watched as Emily played on the swings, her movements slow and detached. Gone was the energetic child who used to pump her legs so high she could almost touch the sky. Now it was like she was dragging herself through the motions, just existing without any spark. As Emily swung back and forth, Maggie's eyes drifted over her daughter's body, looking for any more signs, anything that might explain what had happened. That stain on Emily's pants, it wasn't normal. It couldn't be. But Emily still wasn't talking, and every second of her silence drove Maggie deeper into her own head, spinning with questions and fears she didn't want to acknowledge. When they got home, Maggie led Emily upstairs, trying to keep things casual, like it was just another routine day. "Let's get you cleaned up," she said, guiding her daughter into the bathroom. As Maggie helped Emily change, her hands froze. She noticed faint bruises, small but undeniable, on Emily's inner thighs. Her heart lurched painfully in her chest, and the room seemed to spin around her for a second. She didn't want to believe what her eyes were telling her. The ache in her gut was like a blade, twisting deeper with every breath she took. "Emily," Maggie's voice was barely a whisper now. "Did someone hurt you?" Emily looked away, her little shoulders trembling. She pulled her shirt tighter around her, as if she could disappear into it. No words came out, but her silence, this terrified, guilt-ridden silence, said more than Maggie could bear. After helping Emily get dressed, Maggie sat in her own bedroom, staring blankly at the wall, numb. Her mind was screaming for answers, but her heart was shattered by the possibility of what those answers could be. She had to talk to someone. Fiona, her stepmother, had always been the calm one, the steady rock in the storm. Maybe Fiona could help her make sense of this. Later, as they sat in the kitchen, Maggie finally broached the subject. "I think something's wrong with Emily, Mum," she said, her voice breaking slightly. There was blood on her pants last night, and now I'm seeing bruises. I'm scared." What if something happened to her? Fiona looked up from her tea, her expression calm as ever. She didn't seem shaken by Maggie's words. "It could be nothing, Maggie," Fiona said gently. "You know how kids are. Maybe she fell, or she's just going through some early changes. It could be her period, even though she's young. Let's not jump to conclusions." Maggie wanted to believe her, but something inside her said Fiona was wrong. This wasn't an accident, it wasn't just a scrape from playing too hard. There was a deeper, darker truth here, and she was terrified of finding it. As night fell again, Maggie felt more lost than ever. Every path seemed to lead to more questions, and each answer she could imagine was worse than the last. She was trapped, spiraling in doubt and anguish, her love for Emily driving her forward, even as fear clouded every step. Maggie sat in the waiting room, her foot tapping nervously against the cold tile floor. The fluorescent lights above buzzed softly, casting a sterile glow over the otherwise quiet room. Emily sat beside her still, her eyes distant, fixed on a corner of the room that seemed to hold her attention more than anything Maggie had said on the drive over. She hadn't said much, though. What could she say? It had been 2 days since Maggie had seen that red stain on Emily's pants, and every minute since then had felt like she was suffocating. The uneasy silence between them had grown louder, more oppressive, and now they were here, waiting for answers Maggie wasn't sure she wanted to hear. The door to the doctor's office creaked open, and a nurse stepped out. "Emily Franklin?" Maggie stood up quickly, almost too quickly. Her heart was racing, and she could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Come on, Em," she whispered gently, placing a hand on her daughter's shoulder as they followed the nurse into the examination room. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic, the air cool and clinical. Dr. Saunders, a middle-aged woman with kind but serious eyes, greeted them with a small nod. "Emily," she said softly, looking between the two. "We'll take good care of you today. Maggie, you can stay if you'd like." Maggie nodded, her throat too tight to respond. She took a seat in the corner, watching as Emily climbed onto the examination table. The checkup felt like it took an eternity, every second dragging as Dr. Saunders worked in silence, her face a mask of professionalism. When it was over, Dr. Saunders motioned for Maggie to join her outside the room. "Emily, wait here, okay?" she said, giving her daughter a tight smile before stepping into the hallway with the doctor. Maggie's palms were sweaty, her hands fidgeting nervously as she waited for him to speak. "So?" she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. She wasn't sure she could handle what was coming next. Dr. Saunders' face was grave, and she sighed deeply before speaking. "It's not her period, Maggie." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "The blood wasn't from menstruation. It appears that Emily has been, well, there's evidence of trauma, likely caused by some form of abuse." Maggie's stomach lurched, and for a moment the world around her spun. Abuse. The word echoed in her mind, a hammer striking the fragile surface of her reality. She had feared it, but hearing it said out loud made it feel more real, more horrific. "But there's no sign of force or injury that would suggest, an attack," Dr. Saunders added, watching Maggie closely. "It could have been done by an object or fingers, something more subtle. But the fact remains, Maggie, someone hurt your daughter." Maggie felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Her knees wobbled slightly, but she steadied herself against the wall. Who would do this?" she whispered, though she knew Dr. Saunders couldn't answer that. It was a question that had been burning in her since the moment she saw that stain. The doctor shook his head. "I'm sorry, Maggie. I wish I had more to tell you." She nodded, her mind a whirl of thoughts, each more terrifying than the last. The ride home was a blur, Emily silent in the back seat, staring out the window as the city lights passed by in a haze. That night, Maggie couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, her thoughts racing. Who could have done this? The thought of her ex-husband, Trevor, drifted into her mind like a dark cloud. He hadn't been around much lately, but he was still Emily's father. Could he have? No. It seemed impossible, absurd even. Trevor had his faults. He was distant, careless at times, but he wasn't a monster. Maggie shook her head, trying to push the thought away. But it lingered, gnawing at her like a persistent itch she couldn't scratch. As the hours ticked by, her mind wandered to others. Who had been around Emily? There was Trevor, of course, her parents, friends of the family, Jamie. The name hit her like a punch to the chest. Her own father. Jamie had always been good to Emily, always doting on her, always there when Maggie needed help. But lately, something had felt off. A shadow had passed over their interactions, something Maggie hadn't noticed before, but now couldn't ignore. Could it be him? Could her own father have done something so vile? Maggie curled into herself, the weight of suspicion crushing her. The world, her world, was unraveling, and she didn't know how to stop it. Every face she thought of now seemed like a mask, hiding something dark beneath. The worst part was, she didn't know where to turn. All she knew was that someone had hurt her daughter, and she wouldn't stop until she found out who. Maggie sat in the darkened hallway, her body stiff as she listened to the soft creak of the floorboards from Emily's room. It was late, too late for anyone to still be moving about. Her heart quickened, every sound amplified in the stillness of the house. She'd been up every night like this, ever since the incident with Emily, her mind racing, unable to sleep. Something was wrong, and tonight, Maggie was determined to find out what it was. She watched as the door to Emily's room quietly swung open, revealing the figure of her father, Jamie. He stepped out, moving with care, like someone who didn't want to be seen. Maggie froze, her breath catching in her throat. What was he doing in there? He hadn't said anything about checking on Emily before going to bed. His back was turned to her, and as he pulled the door shut behind him, Maggie's eyes narrowed, suspicion creeping into her chest like a slow-burning fire. "Dad?" Maggie's voice cut through the silence, sharp and unexpected. Jamie stopped, startled. He turned to face her, blinking under the dim light from the hallway. His face, usually calm and composed, briefly showed a flicker of something. Surprise, guilt. Maggie couldn't be sure. He cleared his throat, smoothing his hands over his trousers as if to collect himself. "I was just checking on Emily. She couldn't sleep," he said, his voice casual, but there was an edge to it that Maggie couldn't ignore. "She wanted me to tell her a story to help her settle down." Maggie stared at him for a long moment, her mind racing. Jamie had always been good with Emily, doting on her like the perfect grandfather, but something about this felt off. Her instincts told her that this wasn't just an innocent visit. She tried to shake the feeling, but the image of Emily's blood-stained pants flashed in her mind again, twisting her gut. "She didn't mention she was having trouble sleeping," Maggie said, her voice tight. Jamie shrugged, a slight smile tugging at his lips. "Kids don't always tell us everything." With that, he brushed past her, disappearing down the hallway to his bedroom, leaving Maggie standing in the shadows, her mind swirling with questions she couldn't answer. Something about the way he had looked at her, too quick, too dismissive, made her skin crawl. The following days, Maggie couldn't shake her growing doubts about her father. The man she'd known her whole life, who had been her rock after her husband left, now seemed like a stranger. She began watching him closely, observing his every move with the meticulous attention of someone piecing together a puzzle. Jamie went about his days as usual, reading the paper, tending to the garden, helping around the house. But now, every action seemed laden with a hidden meaning, every gesture carrying an undercurrent of secrecy. Maggie's thoughts spiraled deeper into suspicion. She needed proof, something concrete to confirm her gnawing fear. That's when the idea struck her. The phone. She could leave her cell phone in Emily's room at night, recording everything. If there was anything suspicious, she would know. That night, Maggie quietly slipped the phone under Emily's bed, its camera pointing towards the door. She kissed her daughter goodnight, her stomach churning with guilt. This wasn't right, spying on her own family, but if it meant protecting Emily, she had no choice. The following morning, Maggie rushed to retrieve the phone before anyone else was awake. But as she reached under the bed, her hand grasped at empty air. The phone was gone. Panic surged through her. She tore through Emily's room, lifting blankets, checking drawers, but it was nowhere to be found. Her stomach dropped when she heard the sharp clatter of a phone being thrown onto the kitchen counter downstairs. Maggie hurried down, her heart pounding, only to find Fiona standing there, arms crossed, the phone in her hand. Fiona snapped, her eyes flashing with anger. "What the hell do you think you're doing, sneaking around like this?" Maggie stood frozen, her mind scrambling for an explanation, but none came. I needed to know what's happening with Emily," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "Something's not right." Fiona slammed the phone down onto the counter, the sound ringing through the kitchen. "You're losing your mind, Maggie. You've gone from a concerned mother to a paranoid wreck." The words hit Maggie like a slap to the face. The threat was clear. Fiona was serious, and Maggie knew she had the influence to follow through. Her stepmother, the one person she had relied on for support, had turned on her. Now Maggie was alone, isolated, with nowhere to turn and no one to trust. The weight of the silence after Fiona's outburst crushed her, leaving Maggie standing in the kitchen, utterly helpless. Maggie sat on the floor of the living room, legs crossed, feeling the weight of the air around her. The house was eerily quiet, save for the ticking of the clock on the mantel. It had been days. No matter how much she tried to push for answers, Emily's silence loomed large, an impenetrable wall that left Maggie sleepless, restless, and desperate for a way forward. The psychologist's suggestion echoed in her mind. Play therapy. It sounded simple, almost too simple for the magnitude of what they were dealing with. Yet the idea had stuck. Perhaps the only way to reach Emily was through something as innocent as a game. If talking didn't work, then maybe playing could lead to something. Maggie wasn't sure, but at this point she had no other options. It was a thin thread of hope, and she was willing to grasp at anything. She had set up the scene carefully, 2 dolls in her hands as she sat in front of Emily. One doll was meant to be Emily, the other would represent different people in Emily's life. Her father, Trevor, her grandfather, Jamie, and her grandmother, Fiona. Maggie had rehearsed what she would say, how she would gently guide Emily through the scenes, hoping for some small reveal, some gesture or word that could shed light on what had happened. Emily sat across from her, knees pulled up to her chest, her eyes downcast. Maggie could sense the tension in her daughter's posture, the same guarded stillness that had settled over her ever since that night. It broke Maggie's heart to see her like this, but she forced herself to remain calm, steady. This wasn't the time to let her emotions take control. "Hey, sweetie," Maggie began softly, holding up the 2 dolls. "Why don't we play a game? We can pretend these are you and people you know. You can show me what your days are like." Emily didn't respond at first. She stared at the dolls in Maggie's hands, her lips pressed into a thin line. Maggie waited, giving her daughter time. She had learned by now that pushing Emily too hard would only make her retreat further. Slowly, Emily reached out and took the doll that was supposed to be her. It was a small victory, but Maggie didn't let herself get too hopeful just yet. "Okay," Maggie said, her voice light, as if they were playing a regular game. "This one is you, and let's say this one is Daddy." She held up the other doll, the one representing Jamie. "What do you and Daddy do when he's here?" Emily moved the doll a little, but her expression didn't change. She set it down beside the doll that was her. But there was nothing in her face. No flicker of emotion, no sign that this was leading anywhere. Maggie tried not to feel discouraged. It was still early. "How about Grandpa?" Maggie asked, picking up another doll, this time representing her father, Trevor. "What do you and Grandpa do together?" Again, Emily moved the doll without much enthusiasm, placing it beside her own. The scene was flat, empty, as if Emily were going through the motions without truly engaging. Maggie's chest tightened. She was starting to wonder if this was all a waste of time, if maybe her daughter was too closed off for even this gentle approach to work. Her mind raced back to the bloodstain, to the gnawing fear that had been eating at her ever since. She glanced at Emily, feeling the pressure build in the pit of her stomach. "Please, Emily, please show me something." But then, without warning, something shifted. Emily picked up the last doll, the one representing her grandmother, Fiona. Maggie watched, holding her breath, as Emily hesitated for a moment. Then, in a movement so subtle, so seemingly innocent, she placed the doll of her grandmother on top of her own. It was a small gesture, quiet, unconscious, but it sent a chill down Maggie's spine. Maggie's heart stopped. Time seemed to stretch out in front of her as she stared at the two dolls, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. Emily had no expression on her face, no sign that she was aware of what she had just done. But the placement of the dolls, the way Fiona's doll hovered over Emily's, it wasn't an accident. It couldn't be. "Emily," Maggie's voice wavered, fear tightening around her throat, like a vice. "Why did you do that?" Emily didn't answer. She didn't even look up. Maggie's world spun, the room closing in around her. The truth hit her like a wave, crashing into her so hard that it left her gasping for breath. Fiona. It was Fiona. Her stepmother. The person she had trusted the most, the person who raised her from a young age and always loved her like a biological mother. This is really beyond imagination. Her fingers clenched around the dolls, the plastic cold against her skin. Maggie couldn't move, couldn't speak. All she could do was sit there, staring at the dolls, as the horrific truth settled in. The room felt darker now, smaller, and in that moment, Maggie knew their lives would never be the same again. Maggie sat at the kitchen table, her hands gripping the cool surface, knuckles white. Across from her sat Fiona, her stepmother, the woman who had been a constant presence in her life for over 20 years. The ticking of the clock on the wall filled the suffocating silence, each second dragging out as Maggie tried to steady her breath. The truth was out now, a dark cloud that hung between them, thick and unbearable. "Why, Fiona?" Maggie's voice trembled with a mixture of fury and disbelief. Her heart pounded, the betrayal stinging so deeply it felt as though her chest might tear apart. "Why would you do that to her? To Emily?" Fiona sat hunched over, her face buried in her hands, shaking her head slowly as if trying to shake off the weight of what she had done. For a long moment, she didn't speak, the room thick with tension. But Maggie wasn't going to let the silence drag on any longer. She slammed her fist on the table, the sound sharp and sudden in the stillness. "Answer me!" she shouted, her voice breaking at the edges. She couldn't bear the thought of it. Of her stepmother, someone she had trusted, doing something so vile to her daughter. Fiona flinched, her shoulders sagging even more. When she finally raised her head, her eyes were red, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I didn't mean for it to happen, Maggie. I swear to God I didn't." Maggie's chest tightened. "Then why did it?" she spat, disgust lacing her words. "How could you not mean to hurt her? You're supposed to protect her." Fiona sobbed harder, but it wasn't the kind of crying that stirred sympathy. Not for Maggie. She wanted to shake the woman, to scream in her face until she understood the gravity of what she had done. Instead, she clenched her fists and waited, breath held tight, for Fiona to finally speak. "I've been struggling," Fiona whispered, her voice barely audible. "For years, with things I don't understand. It's like a sickness, Maggie. I don't know why. I couldn't stop myself. It's like something inside of me took over, something I can't control. I never wanted to hurt Emily. I never wanted—" "You think that excuses anything?" Maggie cut in, her voice low and venomous. She stood up from the table, towering over Fiona, her fists clenched so tightly that her nails dug into her palms. "You think blaming some sickness makes any of this okay? You violated her, my baby girl." Fiona looked down at the floor, too ashamed to meet Maggie's eyes. Her shoulders shook as she tried to speak through her tears, but Maggie was done listening. She didn't care about Fiona's excuses. No explanation could ever make up for what she had done. Maggie wanted to lash out, to scream, to demand answers, but what good would it do? The damage was already done. Emily's innocence had been shattered, and no amount of tears from Fiona could ever undo that. As Maggie turned away, the door creaked open, and Jamie walked in. He stopped in his tracks, sensing the thick tension that had settled in the room. His eyes darted between Maggie and his mother, confusion and worry etched across his face. "What's going on?" Jamie asked, his voice wary. "Maggie, what's happened?" Maggie turned to face him, her eyes hard, filled with the kind of fury that made her whole body tremble. "Your wife," she said, barely able to keep her voice steady. "She hurt Emily." Jamie's face went pale. "What are you talking about?" His voice cracked, eyes widening in disbelief. Maggie took a deep breath, forcing herself to speak through the growing lump in her throat. "She touched her. She abused Jamie. All this time, and you never noticed. You never saw what was happening right under your nose." Jamie staggered back, his hand covering his mouth as if he might be sick. No, that can't be true. She wouldn't do that." "She did," Maggie snapped, pointing at Fiona, who sat weeping in the corner. "She just admitted it." Fiona looked up at Jamie, her face twisted in pain. "I'm so sorry, Jamie," she whimpered. "I'm so sorry." Jamie stumbled backward, his face paling even more, and Maggie knew that he was being torn apart inside. His wife, the woman he had trusted his whole life, had become a monster in his eyes. It wasn't just betrayal. It was the destruction of everything Jamie thought he knew. Jamie's face contorted with shock and anger, his hands falling to his sides as the weight of Maggie's words sank in. He turned to his wife, his voice shaking. "Tell me, Lincoln, please. Tell me she's lying." Lincoln, her father, just mentioned that name. Why is he called Fiona with the name Lincoln? As if the world couldn't spin darker, Maggie's mind flitted back to the dusty box of photographs she had found just days before. She had brushed it off, too preoccupied with Emily's silence, but now, standing in this room thick with betrayal, those images of Jamie and a man she didn't recognize. They were standing close, their arms wrapped around each other in a way that wasn't just friendly. The look in their eyes, it was the kind of gaze people only gave when they were deeply in love. Her mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of memories that now seemed jagged and out of place. Maggie threw the photograph onto his lap. "Who is Lincoln? What are all these lies?" Her words cut through the air like a knife. Jamie's face went pale the moment his eyes landed on the picture. He didn't speak at first, but Maggie could see the shift in his expression, the way his body seemed to collapse under the weight of old, buried memories. "I didn't want you to find out like this," Jamie stammered, his voice hoarse. He looked down at the photograph again, as if it held both his shame and his past. "Lincoln, he was someone I loved, a long time ago." Maggie's heart pounded in her chest. "Loved," she repeated, her voice trembling. "Dad, what are you talking about?" Jamie sighed deeply, rubbing his face with his hands. The weight of years seemed to settle into his bones, making him appear older than Maggie had ever seen him. "Lincoln and I, we were in love, Maggie. Before your mother, before everything. But back then, we couldn't be together. It wasn't safe, so we hid it. We hid everything." Maggie stared at him, struggling to process the words. Her father had been in love with a man. This was the man who had always seemed so straight-laced, so devoted to Maya. How could this be true? "Does Mum know?" Maggie asked quietly, already fearing the answer. Jamie's face crumpled at the mention of Maya. He looked away, pain etched into every line of his face. "She found out," he whispered. "Not right away, but eventually. I think she always knew something was wrong between us, when she finally discovered the truth. She couldn't handle it." Maggie's breath hitched. "You mean, that's why she—" "Yes," Jamie choked out. "It broke her, Maggie. I broke her. She couldn't live with it, knowing that part of my heart still belonged to him. When she took her own life, I knew it was because of me. I destroyed her." Maggie's mind spun, memories of her mother's sudden death flooding back. She had been too young to understand then, but now it all made sense. The quiet sadness that had hung over Maya like a shadow in those final months, the distance, the hurt. And then the final blow came. "Fiona," Jamie continued, his voice barely a whisper, "Fiona is Lincoln." Maggie felt as though the floor had been ripped out from under her. Her stepmother Fiona was Lincoln? The man in the photograph? The man her father had loved? It was too much to grasp. Fiona mustered up the courage to speak. "After your mother's death, your father cut me out of his life. I tried to bury it, to live the way people expected me to, but I couldn't let it go. I changed, transgender surgery. I became Fiona, so I could stay close, so I could be with Jamie in a way that society would accept." Maggie staggered back, her legs weak beneath her. Everything she had believed about her family, about Fiona, about her father, it was all a lie. A carefully constructed web of secrets and deception. And now, standing in the ruins of those lies, Maggie felt lost, betrayed, and utterly broken. 2 days later, Fiona was arrested. The police showed up at the house early in the morning, their presence like a black cloud settling over everything. The neighbors watched from their porches, whispering, wondering what had gone wrong in the perfect family that lived next door. Maggie stood in the doorway, numb, as Fiona was led away in handcuffs, her face pale and her eyes hollow with disbelief. She didn't say a word. Neither did Maggie, but the fallout had only just begun. Jamie, her father, stood in the kitchen later that night, staring down into his glass of whiskey as if it held the answers to all the questions he couldn't ask. His hands trembled slightly, a sign of age that Maggie hadn't noticed until now. He looked up at her, eyes filled with a deep, agonizing confusion. "How could she do this?" he murmured, his voice barely audible. "Maggie, this doesn't make sense. She loved Emily, loves her. There's got to be some mistake. Maybe she wasn't thinking straight, or maybe it was... God, I don't know." His voice cracked. The man Maggie had always seen as strong now, reduced to a broken shell. Maggie felt nothing but a cold, empty distance between them. "You're defending her?" she asked quietly, incredulously. "She hurt Emily, Dad, and you're standing there, trying to make excuses." Jamie slammed his glass down on the counter, whiskey sloshing over the side. "I'm not excusing anything. I just can't understand how this happened. After all these years, after everything, you think I'm just going to turn my back on her? This is my wife, and this is my granddaughter we're talking about." His words hung in the air, heavy with contradictions, but Maggie didn't flinch. She had expected this. Deep down, she knew Jamie wouldn't be able to see Fiona for what she really was. He couldn't. The years of marriage, the shared life, the facade of a loving, stable family. He was too tied up in it, too blind to the cracks that had always been there. "You already turned your back," Maggie said, her voice flat. "On me, on Mom, and now on Emily." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "You let all this happen, and you didn't even see it." Jamie's face twisted in pain. "Maggie, that's not fair. You know I didn't—" "You let her know, him stay in our lives." Maggie cut him off, her voice rising. "You ignored the signs, the way he was with me growing up, and now look what's happened. I trusted you to protect Emily, and you couldn't even see the monster standing right next to you." Silence fell over the room like a stone dropped into a still pond. Jamie didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Maggie knew in that moment that whatever bond they had left had been severed. She couldn't look at him the same way anymore. To her, Jamie was no longer her father, just a man who had failed to protect his family from falling apart. Later that week, Maggie filed for separation from family. She packed up what little she and Emily had and moved into a small apartment on the other side of town, far from the house filled with memories that now felt tainted. The legal proceedings against Fiona or Lincoln moved quickly. Too quickly, it seemed. There were hearings to prepare for, lawyers to meet, questions that felt invasive and harsh. But Maggie went through it all with a quiet, steely determination. She had made her choice. There was no going back to that house, to that life, to the woman who had violated the deepest trust Maggie had ever known. Fiona, Lincoln would face justice, and Maggie would do everything in her power to make sure Emily would never have to suffer through this again. The nights were long, and the loneliness was real. But Maggie knew, deep down, that she had done the right thing. Emily needed her now more than ever, and Maggie would not fail her daughter the way Jamie had failed them all. As Maggie lay in bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, she felt a strange calm settle over her. It wasn't peace. Not yet. But it was the beginning of something new, something she could rebuild, even from the ashes of everything she had lost. The small house sat at the end of a quiet street, its weathered white paint chipping slightly along the edges. To anyone passing by, it might seem like just another modest home in an ordinary neighborhood. But for Maggie and Emily, this place was everything. a sanctuary where the dark shadows of their past couldn't follow. After everything that had happened, the arrest, the court hearings, and the painful unraveling of family secrets, this was their fresh start. Maggie stood in the middle of the living room, boxes still half-packed, taking in the stillness. The house wasn't much, just 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that had seen better days, and a tiny backyard with overgrown grass. But it was theirs, and that was enough. Emily was upstairs, tucked away in her new room. Maggie hadn't heard a sound from her in hours, but she wasn't worried. Emily needed space. After the events that had torn their lives apart, Maggie had learned to let her daughter find solace in her own time. She hoped, though, that in this house they could start healing, one day at a time. She glanced at the kitchen clock. It was nearing 6 p.m., and the evening light filtered softly through the dusty windows, casting a golden hue on the walls. The quiet felt different here. It wasn't the suffocating silence that used to fill their old house, where every sound seemed to echo with secrets and guilt. This was a peaceful kind of silence, one that Maggie wasn't used to, but desperately needed. Maggie knew they still had a long way to go. The scars of what had happened were far from healed. Emily's withdrawn demeanor, her quiet stares, and the nightmares that haunted her sleep wouldn't just disappear. But Maggie was ready to fight for her daughter, to protect her in any way she could. That fight hadn't ended when Fiona was sent to prison. If anything, it had just begun. She picked up the phone, scrolling through her contacts until she found Dr. Williams's number. The child psychologist had been recommended to her by a local support group, one of the many resources Maggie had started reaching out to in the wake of the revelations. Play therapy had uncovered so much, but now Emily needed professional help, someone who could guide her through the trauma, someone with the tools to help her process what had been done. Maggie hesitated for a moment before dialing. She had always prided herself on being strong, on not needing anyone's help. But she wasn't alone anymore. She couldn't afford to be. "Hi, this is Maggie Fisher," she said into the phone once the receptionist answered. "I'm calling to schedule an appointment for my daughter, Emily." As she spoke, her voice steadied. There was something about taking this step that felt like progress, like they were moving forward, no matter how slowly. Later that evening, Maggie and Emily sat at the small kitchen table, their plates of reheated leftovers between them. Emily ate quietly, her eyes fixed on her food, not meeting Maggie's gaze. Maggie watched her for a moment, trying to gauge how her daughter was feeling. But there were no clues, no hints, just silence. "How's your room, sweetie?" Maggie asked gently, breaking the quiet. Emily shrugged, but didn't speak. Maggie felt that familiar pang of helplessness, the kind that had become all too common over the last few months. She couldn't push Emily, couldn't force her to talk. That had been one of the hardest lessons to learn, giving Emily the space to heal on her own terms. But it still hurt to see her like this, so far away, even when they were sitting just across the table from each other. After a few more minutes of quiet, Emily finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's okay." Maggie looked up, surprised. "Yeah? I'm glad. We can decorate it however you want, you know. Make it really yours." Emily didn't respond, but there was a slight nod, and that was enough for Maggie. Small steps. That's all they could take for now. Over the next few weeks, Maggie found herself leaning more on the people around her than she ever had before. Friends she hadn't spoken to in years reached out, offering support, bringing over meals, and even just sitting with her in the evenings when the loneliness crept in. There were moments when Maggie felt like she was drowning in the enormity of everything they had been through, but the support from others was like a lifeline, pulling her back to shore. She also started attending a local survivors group, a space for parents and children who had gone through similar traumas. Sitting in those meetings, listening to stories that mirrored her own, Maggie realized how vital community was. It was through these connections that she found not just strength, but hope. She wasn't fighting this battle alone anymore, and that made all the difference. As the days turned into weeks, life in the small house began to take shape. Maggie and Emily settled into a routine. Small, simple things like cooking dinner together, going for walks around the neighborhood, or reading before bed. It wasn't perfect. Some nights, the nightmares still came for Emily, and Maggie would wake to the sound of her daughter crying in the dark. But each morning, they faced the day together, a little stronger than before. Maggie knew the past would never completely fade away. The pain, the betrayal, they were part of their story now. But standing there, watching Emily in the yard, the warm sunlight on her daughter's face, Maggie felt something she hadn't in a long time. Hope. They were moving forward, together. And that was enough. And that was the story of Maggie and Emily. A journey filled with pain, but also resilience and hope. Step by step, they learned to stand back up, move past the trauma, and find peace in their lives. Though the past lingers, Maggie and Emily showed us that true strength comes from love and unity. Thank you all for taking the time to listen to this story. If it resonated with you, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to join me for more heartfelt and emotional stories. And share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think Maggie and Emily can continue building a better life together? I'll be back with more special stories. See you in the next video. Remember to stay healthy and always stay strong. Goodbye.